Hello again, and welcome to the final critical thinking video lesson about synthesis. Like in the other videos, we're going to start with a definition and then give a couple examples before we go into how to use this in a research paper and how to check your thinking. You may be familiar with the concept of synthesis when it comes to synthetic fabric. In this sense, synthetic does not mean fake. What they do when they make synthetic fabric is they take lots of different chemicals and lots of different fibers from lots of different locations, and then they weave them together to make the final product, one whole fabric. So that's what you do when you synthesize something. You take lots of pieces of information from lots of different places, and then you weave them together to make one final conclusion. When you're doing this, make sure to keep in mind how each piece relates to the other pieces and what they say when you weave them together that's better or more advanced than what they say when they're standing alone in their original source. As you're doing this, make sure to group your pieces into common categories, because if they're not in common categories and they aren't significantly related to each other, your synthesis is going to sound confused because it crosses across all sorts of different areas instead of focusing on one area and developing upon that. And make sure also to keep in mind how each piece relates to your larger purpose, because they should all be arguing in the same direction. In a similar way as to it'll sound confused if you argue in different categories, it'll also sound confused if you argue for many different purposes. The analogy that we used for analysis was to take a puzzle, take apart the pieces you want to look at, and get a better look at them when they're out of the puzzle. For synthesis, we need to take these pieces from separate puzzles and put them together to make a new picture by interlocking them into a new puzzle. Like these examples below, we have pictures that don't look like they'd go together. We have a winter scene and a summer scene. We have ballerinas and a sink. But when you take a closer look at these puzzles, you can see that they are actually cut with the same pattern. So you can exchange pieces from different puzzles and put them together in a way that somehow still makes sense. Now, when that comes to synthesizing information, you would need to look carefully at all the different sources you have, see what pieces work well together, what pieces make a picture together, and see, can I make that picture make sense? Can I make that picture work with my larger purpose and what I'm trying to create? Our Odyssey warm-up asked us to do a synthesis using Odysseus's men. The question said, using the behavior of Odysseus's men from the Lotus Eaters episode, the Aeolia episode, and the Cattle of the Sun God episode, perform a synthesis that describes what their personalities might be like. So, a synthesis is to take little pieces from separate things and put them together into one big important thing. So our big thing is the personalities of the crew members, and we need to make that using the little things that are their behavior in each individual episode. So how can we put the pieces of each individual episode together into the larger idea of their personalities as a whole? In order to perform this synthesis, we have to really understand how his men act, and we have to understand what they did in each of these situations: the Lotus Eaters, Aeolia, and Cattle of the Sun God. When Odysseus and his men reach the land of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus tells his men to go check out what's there. They go, and they decide to taste the food at that island and become carried away and stay there, even though Odysseus explicitly told them to come back and report to him. Now, you can say that these men were drugged and had no control over their actions, but there's still the fact of their disobedience to Odysseus, even if it was slightly outside of their control. Secondly, after departing from Aeolia, the men see Odysseus has this mysterious bag that he has told them not to touch until they return to Ithaca. Now the men think Odysseus is hiding treasure from them because they're both curious and selfish. So, when they're almost back to Ithaca, they decide to open the bag and they get off course and are put many miles back from their home. This mistake that they make has to do, again, with their unwillingness to obey Odysseus. They couldn't even wait a little while longer until they finally did reach Ithaca, they had to open it right now and disobey their captain. Lastly, at the episode Cattle of the Sun God, the men disobey Odysseus yet again by killing the cattle that he told them they absolutely could not mess with. Like the Lotus Eaters episode, there were factors outside of their control here, what with the gods creating a storm and with their own starvation looming over their heads. They still disobeyed Odysseus. They didn't trust him. They didn't rely on his authority. They instead relied on their own selves and decided to make a decision that turned out very poorly for them, explicitly because they disobeyed direct orders from their captain. All of these episodes have something in common in regards to how Odysseus's men act. So what is it that they have in common, and what can we use from those commonalities in order to make a larger decision, a bigger picture about the personalities of Odysseus's men? What all this says when it comes together is that the men are disobedient and reckless. They act on their own desires even though they are supposed to be obeying their captain and using common sense. While a lot of the episodes and situations we looked at had external factors, there was still the men's unwillingness to obey Odysseus. They didn't trust him, and they decided to go off of their own selves, their own opinions, instead of what their captain told them to do. So that bigger picture is the men as a whole are disobedient, they don't use common sense, and they're easily duped. That's more than what the individual episodes say, because the individual episodes indicate situations of bad behavior, but when you put them together, it indicates a overall pattern or personality of misbehavior when it comes to the men. Synthesis is a crucially important skill to use when writing research papers, because you're going to need to synthesize all of the information that you use. So that's especially your original source and any additional sources you're using in your paper. You need to take the important pieces of each source and put them together to make a new conclusion that you're going to argue throughout your paper. Again, you need to take these pieces from different sources, so that's different puzzles, to use our analogy. Then you put them together in a way that makes sense in your argument and in the bigger picture. It's very important that you stay true to the original information from all of your sources. So you can't alter that information so it fits better into your idea and your essay. You have to keep the information exactly as it is in the original sources they come from. Let's get back to that dragon paper we're pretending to write. In our analysis and evaluation videos, we looked closely at one source. Now let's look closely at a couple other sources in order that we can synthesize those sources to make a grander conclusion. So again, we're going to analyze some extra sources so that we can synthesize all those sources together. So here are the three sources we're going to talk about. First one, The Evolution of Dragon Legends, is the one we've talked about before. It was a good source, so we're looking at it again. The second one is an article called Scientific Explanations for Dragon Sightings in Ancient Times. And our third source is Dangerous Friend, Different Cultures' Views on Dragons. We're going to look at these sources, read them, pull out the important pieces, and see what those important pieces say that each individual source does not say by itself. To repeat, these are the three most important points we took from our first source. That hunters' tall tales helped the dragon legend grow, that stories and myths with dragons were told to scare children and teach lessons, and that after the first of dragon tales were written, the legend started to fade. From these 3 points, we concluded that person-to-person communication had a large role in shaping and spreading the dragon legend. We got this because each of those 3 points describes either who told the story, who the story was told to, or what method of communication those people were using to tell and translate this story. Our second source, Scientific Explanations for Dragon Sightings in Ancient Times, tells us the following. It tells us that people thought volcanoes and geysers were mythical beasts. Second, it says that mass hysteria led to the spreading of the story. And finally, it says that people began worshipping dragons as gods in order to protect themselves from unnameable foes. From these 3 points, we can conclude that uncertainty and fear led people to invent dragon myths as a coping mechanism, because each of these 3 points comes back to uncertainty, fear, or explaining, and that they had to say something in order to understand or contextualize these things that were going on. From our third source, Dangerous Friend, Different Cultures' Views on Dragons, we can gain the following. First, most cultures created dragons that were to be feared or worshipped. Second, once befriended, dragons could become allies in battle, according to legends. And finally, that a dragon could never be tamed, only appeased. From this source, we can gather that the role dragons had in legends centered on strength and power, because all of these pieces of information show us that these cultures created these legends either to feel powerful or to protect themselves from powerful forces outside their control. So now that we've done an analysis of each individual source, we can finally create our synthesis based on what all 3 sources say together. To repeat, these are the conclusions we made of each individual source. First, that the role dragons had in legends centered on strength and power. Also, uncertainty and fear led people to invent dragon myths as a coping mechanism. And finally, person-to-person communication had a large role in shaping and spreading the dragon legend. So, what do these 3 conclusions have in common that we can put together and develop upon and beyond what our first original 3 sources say? Thus, our synthesis goes like this. Dragon legends came about because they helped people bond over mutual fear and hope for power and control they didn't currently have. We got to this because each of our 3 points from our 3 sources says 1 or 2 of the items mentioned here, so we put those 1 or 2 from each bullet point and get the final synthesis on the right. So that's what you should do when you synthesize. You take certain points from each source that you've got, the ones they have in common, the ones that they almost have in common, and develop upon them all to say something that goes beyond what your original sources say alone. So then your synthesis should either be more elaborate, more intelligent, or more broad than what the original sources say. As always, it's super important with critical thinking to be able to justify what you've said. So that's metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, making sure what you've thought and what you've said is actually good. This is especially important with synthesis because your reader is not going to have the same information you're going to have, even less so than with the other terms we've mentioned, because you need to have read many different sources in order to synthesize those sources, and your reader is definitely not going to have read 10 different sources like you have. So you need to be very, very clear with your synthesis in order for it to make sense to somebody else. To get back to that puzzle analogy, make sure the pieces that you've taken out and put together actually agree and have something in common. Because if you just put them together because you wish they were together or because they sound good together, they're not going to actually make that bigger picture that they should make. So make sure that they say something together that the original source doesn't say on its own. You can't just repeat something that was in a different original source because then you can just use that original source instead. It has to be something better than each source could ever say on its own. Lastly, you should ask yourself, first, does your synthesis actually make sense? So take a step back and see if it still makes sense when you're not looking so deeply into it. Also ask if you've used all of the proper pieces, because you can't leave a piece out because it's too complicated or you don't like it. You have to include all of the relevant pieces of information. Also, use only the proper pieces, so don't include an extra piece that makes it sound better or makes it easier or makes it whatever, because if it doesn't actually go with the synthesis, it's going to drag down the synthesis. Make sure there are no gaps in your information. So is there anything you've forgotten? Is there anything that isn't fully explained? Because if there is, your synthesis won't make as much sense and its conclusion won't be as strong. And lastly, to bring it right back to the puzzle analogy, if you put the pieces you took out back into the original puzzles they come from, would they still look the same? Because you cannot change the puzzle pieces when you take them out and synthesize them. You have to leave the information fully intact in order for your synthesis to be fully true and fully based on your original source material. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense at all.